Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to have you over here today. We have a very exciting topic. One of the things that we realized is that there's so many parts of Postman, it's so hard to understand all the different parts. So we labeled this webinar, I didn't know Postman could do that. So we're going to be talking about the collaborative workflows with collections and workspaces that you can achieve with Postman. Hi, my name is Isaac Cohen. I'm the global head of field services. I'm based out of New York. We're joined here by Vitor. Vitor, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, Vitor Monteiro. I run solutions engineering for EMEA and APAC, and I'm logging in from London and really excited about the presentation today. I hope you enjoy it. Should I kick it off, Isaac?
Kick it off, Vitor.
Cool. Um, so I hope you like today's presentation. We've kind of split it in two organic parts. The first one, I'm just going to do some context setting with a few slides and some browsing around. And then Isaac is going to do, if I may say so, a very cool demo about all the things you probably don't know Postman could do. To make this a bit more interactive, we're going to ask you some questions and do some very simple polls as we do that context setting. And if you want now, you could just type on chat your name and where you're connecting from, so we know kind of where are all the folks that we're talking to today. Okay, without further ado, here we go. So as someone that's been in the industry for a while, I really find that a lot of the times people throw solutions at you without you having a problem. But I always like to always surface the problems first, and then when we have a problem, then we can identify solutions for it. So the first part of the presentation is really, why is Isaac demoing that in the later stages? Why could you benefit from Postman? And this all starts with three trends that we've identified talking to, if I may say, hundreds of customers across the two of us, about how we got to a place which is really not optimal in our point of view. So the first trend or kind of tendency that we saw in the market, and this is not a thing from 1 year or 2 years, but goes back probably decades when I started becoming an engineer, is how many APIs we interact with, deal with on a daily basis. So there's a question there. You can start as answering as I go through the topic. So basically, back in the day when, and I go back to, without trying to reveal too much of my age, when I started as an engineer, and probably to a lot of you still today, an API is that thing you build when you need to transfer data across applications. It's never in the forefront of anyone's mind. So we've built a whole application, a monolith, and no, we need to send some data across, and then we build an API. Throughout my career, I worked in companies, I worked in banking, and then APIs were more a predominant term that were more understood across a broad spectrum of people, not just developers. And then at GitHub was the first time, I guess, where when I worked there, that I started first hearing the concept of API first quite a while ago. So you could expand a platform by yourself and interact with an application programmatically. So the conclusion here is that I feel like this all happened too fast. Right? No one was planning, or although APIs became more and more strategic, no one was planning to for this growth and how to manage this growth in all the vertents that this involves. So we asked the question, how many APIs does your company produce interact with? I'm going to end the poll and share the results, but you can see a lot of people on hundreds and quite a shared result between tens and thousands, and 10% of you actually said 10,000. So that's kind of the first layer of this cake is when we got to the 10,000s or the thousands, in my opinion, the industry woke up to it, didn't kind of smoothly went in that direction. So for the second layer of this issue is what we believe is the increasingly hard to discover and interact with APIs. And let me give you an example. Imagine that today I am going to integrate with a third-party API. So let me imagine that going here, sorry. And I'm going to Google and I want to consume an AI API. So I'm just going to do AI API and use the other search engine. AI API, and I can go through some vendors, I see sponsorships, etc. And let's imagine that I'm going with OpenAI because it's actually something I use. And I just want to experiment some text generation. That's all I want to do. So I go through OpenAI and I go over here. So I clearly see here API reference. I could have easily gone into overview and then check here the text generation, and I get brought into the docs. So now I'm close to what I need to do, and let's imagine that this is the first thing I find. So I just copy paste this into my IDE, and I try to run it, and hopefully I can just see a sample payload of this without looking too much into the payload. So this usually runs extremely quickly, and I can see here there's an incorrect API provided. So now I have to go and sign in here, try and find where is the API, create an account, etc. So all I want as a developer is really just to execute something that returns this to me. That's all I want to do. And I imagine a lot of you are saying, well, that wasn't too bad, was it? So two things. I'll tell you a little secret. They just remodeled the website probably in the last 6 hours, because when I did this with Isaac yesterday, it took me about 10 clicks. So good job, OpenAI. You're getting there. But this is the best of breed. What you're looking at is the best possible outcome you can have. Clicking 3 or 4 things and then copy pasting something that's going to give you an authorization. This is as best as you can get. Now imagine that this can be 10 and 20 times worse. However, Isaac will show you the other side of this coin and how experimentation can be made much easier. So I didn't see the results of the poll. Isaac, do you have, okay, here they are. So I love how most of you actually went from the meme answer. Are you sure minutes and hours is the right metric? So in my little experience, I would probably need 5-10 minutes to go about it, right? I would now need to get a token. I've opened that website a million times, so I didn't go blind into it. So I'll probably be on the 10 minutes or plus. And this is someone that knows the website, knows what they're looking for, etc. So let's see how Isaac does that later on. And Isaac, so we break here for a second. Can you tell me what the metric is? Because we measure this on our state of the API report and other things. Like failing authentication is one of the reasons that gets people to stop playing with an API the fastest. Is that correct? Do you have that metric?
It's actually the & one reason why developers fail at using an API. It's actually the authentication. People get stuck at the authentication layer. And then they actually give up afterwards, unfortunately, based off of what we see through our data. And you can imagine that experience as a first-time developer, even trying to use an API, getting stuck and throwing their hands up. And again, that was best of breed that you just saw. Think about all of those internal APIs that you may have at your company that I'm going to guess aren't documented well. May not have all of the endpoints, you may not have all of that information over there. And so that's what I think a lot about the state of interacting and discovering APIs today.
Cool. So thank you for that, Isaac. And let's go to the third trend. And there are more than that. Before this presentation, we selected 3 that will provide you some solutions for. So the last one is that there's definitely more stakeholders needed to create APIs. So there's, again, back when I started coding, which was a while ago, API was a term known to developers and I'll say broadly engineers, QA engineers, and that was it. API was a geek thing. API is no longer a dev thing. API is very much something that touches the API designer, that sometimes is not the same person as the engineer actually coding that API. Testers and QA automation and QA engineering come into the process much, much earlier. Security, if you go see our state of the API report for the last 2 years, and you can see the responses around security vulnerabilities around API development, it's phenomenally high. So those folks always have to be involved, and you know how much can come from an API vulnerability. But then you have the consumers that you can provide preview APIs that then feedback back to the API designer or the engineers. And then you have a product owner in a lot of companies where on API first companies, the API is the product. So you have all these people interacting where back in the day was just the developer, at least in my experience, and this has grown throughout my career. So in this stage, I would ask, when you're developing an API, how many people do you usually interact with other than yourself? So the poll should be coming up just now. Yeah, thank you. So Isaac, what do you think would be your answer on this one?
Oh, for me nowadays, it's 5+. Like I look at this picture, look at how many arrows there are going all over the place. It's terrifying. It's so scary. But that's the reality, right? Like that's the reality that we live in of talking to all these different stakeholders in order to just produce this API. Because there's so many different factors now that we need to test for, that we need to make sure it's secure, that we need to make sure that it actually is doing what it is intended to do.
Cool. Thank you, Isaac. And a lot of people agree with you. Definitely, it's between 2 and 5 and 5+ from the poll. Let me share the results with the audience. Love the participation, by the way. 2/3 of you are answering these questions. So very good. So these are our trends. So you layer these together, and the end result is the inability or how hard it is to pick out of the box APIs to create new products. And overall, API should be that high level instrument that you say, I need to get some data, I need to manipulate this application, and I need to coordinate with these 3 APIs. I need to figure out if there's an API internally to my company that already does this. And if there's thousands of them, if the people that own them, that work on them, are all over the place, and if it's hard to discover them, to search for them, to experiment with them, I think, having talked for years about inner source, sometimes it's just easier to do it yourself and just to duplicate work, because that's just, everyone has a day job, and sometimes that's just easy, and you kind of lose that ability. So all of these together, and like I said, there is more. Check the state of the API report to see other trends that you can see in the industry. This is when you combine all of these, this is what we label internal as API chaos, which ultimately affects productivity, tremendously affects collaboration and innovation. Because if you're prevented, if your ecosystem and context prevents you from quickly innovating and quickly taking an out of the shelf API and experimenting with that and deciding this is not what I need, this is what I need, and do those iterations super quickly, that will definitely contribute to, as an engineer speaking, job satisfaction, but as a business, potentially quite a lot of productivity left on the table. And I like this image to kind of summarize the 3 trends, especially the explosion of APIs and stakeholders, is that when we talk to customers, APIs are super important for everyone. But the state at where companies are managing API portfolios and API workflows for development is not something that has been designed. It's something that you landed on as a contribution to those factors. So as I finish my part of the presentation, and I'll continue giving a shout out here and there, we believe that Postman collections, which are also described as executable documentation, are the best way to evaluate, document, test, mock, and to me, the most important part, collaborate around API development, regardless of your role, regardless of where you come from, your level of expertise around API. We have the collections have the ability to lower the barrier of entry, to bring folks, product owners, business owners, to interact and have conversation with an engineer, an API designer. And I truly believe in this decade, this is where I want to work with an API. I want to work with an API in Postman. That's obviously my personal preference. I hope by the end of this session, you decide to experiment some of the things Isaac wants to show. So Isaac, do you want to take it over now?
Thank you so much, Vitor. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch into demo mode. Specifically, we saw the experience beforehand with discovering and interacting with APIs. Well, what does that experience look like in the Postman context? How can you find APIs? But more importantly, how can you get to interacting with those APIs as quickly as possible? So what I'm going to do is I am going to first navigate. You all can follow along with me, by the way, if you go to postman.com. What I'd like to do is I'd like to explore and integrate the public APIs that are available. So I'm going to look at the public, what we term as the public API network, which allows community users to publish the APIs that they're using publicly. We see right away that there's a whole bunch of APIs that are trending over here. So if I want to start to feel around, like what are the most popular APIs in the Postman community, I could see Salesforce, Stripe, et cetera, et cetera. I can look at some of the APIs that are looked at in the spotlight. I can also start to look at specific categories. So remember, beforehand, Vitor was looking for an AI API. Well, what if we just look at artificial intelligence and start to look at some of the APIs that are available over there? But here's the key. We are giving you a curated experience of a lot of the APIs that are out there. But what if you were looking for that AI API? What if you were looking for that open AI API? And what if you wanted to interact with that open AI API as quickly as possible? Well, I can actually just search for it. So I'm going to search for OpenAI. And what you'll see over here is that we are now searching all of Postman, right? You can search only your own collections. You can search your private API. We're right now looking at all of Postman. And very quickly, I'm navigated to the OpenAI workspace. Over here, I get my documentation very quickly. But again, as a developer, the thing that I want to do as quickly as possible is interact with this API. And so maybe I want to create a completion using the OpenAI API. Well, I click on this create completion. And the first thing that I might do, oh, look, the blue send button. Let me click on that blue send button. But oh no, that missing authorization. Well, remember that experience before, and you had to scroll down through many lines of code to actually figure out what's going on. Over here, we make it very, very clear. We've missed the authorization. What if we can guide you to creating this new authorization? How do I actually authorize with OpenAI? Well, let me click the button. I'm going to click authorize with OpenAI. This gives me the exact step-by-step to authorize to create a token. All right, I navigate to this specific page. I create a new secret key. And let me enter in that key over here. And within a couple of seconds, I actually get the full response back. Again, the point over here is we want to make it as easy for you to start interacting with APIs, but to also authorize with those APIs and to understand exactly which responses you should be getting. If I didn't know, even before that, I may have wanted to look at what an example of this API looked like as well. Well, I can click through a whole bunch of examples as well. So we're giving you that ability to get to the API as quickly as possible. There's also other information over here. Like we forget the simple stuff. Like this is a 200 OK. The time it actually took, the size of this. This starts to become very, very important later on when we start to try and debug certain things. But what if I wanted to edit something, right? So I've sent a request very quickly, but now I actually want to continue to interact with this API. I actually want to edit these API requests. Maybe I want to add different things to the body or the parameters. Well, this is where the concept of forking comes into play. Vitor, can you explain to us what forking means in Postman?
Sure. Can we change to that slide, Isaac? Forking, if you're familiar with the concept of forking on version control, it works pretty much the same way. But before explaining technically what forking is, the use cases that you would use it for is, like Isaac said, you want to change and experiment with something that you own. And potentially, if it's an open source API like OpenAI, propose bug fix improvements. But to me, the biggest advantage of forking, which doesn't occur just on open stuff, but it happens with internal APIs. If you have a Postman enterprise solution where you have a private Postman team that no one can see, is that historically, a lot of users share Postman collections by just exporting and importing JSON files with a collection or sharing collection links, etc. That creates, and I know because I've talked to a lot of companies and we did polls on this creates this anxiety that if Isaac sent me a zip file with a collection, in 2 days, I'm going to go on Slack and ask Isaac, is this still the last version? And next day, I'm going to say, Isaac is still the last version. Every time a request goes wrong, I will ask, Isaac, did you change anything? Just because I don't know. So the best thing I love about the forking model, regardless if it's open source or not, is that I can just click the pull changes button and understand if OpenAI had made any change to their API. So I know that I'm on the latest version. If there is a problem, could be a problem on their side, but likely probably something I haven't figured out with. So forking to me is a game changer in the way that we keep a track of the golden source and we always get the updates. It's like, I usually compare this, you wouldn't download a Git repo from GitHub and email it to someone, right? You'd probably want them to fork it or clone or be added to that group. And we do that with APIs. We do download it and share it with someone instead of linking them or giving them access to. And Isaac is going to talk more about that later. But that's a bit of an intro into forking.
So let's actually look at what this looks like. So I have my OpenAI collection, and I now want to edit it. I want to do some things, but I also want to keep in sync with this collection. So if any changes happen, I get notified about that. Well, let me create a fork. I'm going to click create a fork. I'm going to fork this into this specific workspace called Postman generator workspace, which we're going to get to. And I'm going to watch this original collection. Again, if any changes happen, I will be notified about that. So I click fork collection. And now I have pretty much full edit rights over here. So I can add a couple of more completions. Maybe if I start to interact with body and ask for certain things, I can now start to save examples. This is now my own private workspace with the OpenAI collection. So within a couple of seconds, we've been able to fork, but also edit a lot of these requests within this collection. Okay. We've spoken about a couple of interesting things beforehand. We've now been able to discover and interact with an API very quickly. But I'd like to switch to a different topic. I'd like to now actually create an API with you all together. What does the experience look like to create an API, to collaborate on an API with many different stakeholders? So let's start this together. Okay, folks. We have a new web app that we're creating. It's called the Postman generator. What this web app needs to do is whenever we put an input text, it's going to generate a Postman with the input text. So for example, if we want a Postman that's holding a coffee, we'll ask the Postman generator to create a Postman that's holding a coffee, and it will generate that image for us automatically. In order to do this, we need to build the backend API. So let's create this API together. What does this generally look like for a developer? Well, any good developer, like you want to get started coding right away. I actually already created an Express API over here. So you can see this is an Express API. Let me start it up. Imagine I'm coding, I'm starting to create some of these endpoints. So I have this API Postman endpoint. Well, the first thing that as a developer you want to do is you want to interact with this API, right? Like you want to make sure that what you're creating actually makes sense, which is usually where we start to create that collection from scratch. So I'm going to click create a blank collection. I'll call this Postman. I'll add a new request, and let's see if that status URL is working. Oopsies. And within a couple of seconds, I'm going to get back a status OK. So imagine this is what a developer does, right? I would imagine that most people use Postman like this, where you just simply want to get started as quickly as possible, creating this new request and interacting with that request. Ah, there we go. We have status OK. Okay, so we've begun. Here's the thing. What does this API actually look like in the back end, right? Like, how would this API actually work? Let's try out a couple of things. I've created a collection already for us. So this is the Postman generator collection. We can see we have the status OK, and we have this Postman. So imagine I'm coding this Postman endpoint, and I now have to interact with it. Let me send the request. And what this should do is this should generate an image of this new Postman that's holding a hot coffee, right? So we're interacting with this API, but oh, look, we got a response back. We got a response back from this Postman API with all of this data back. Like, Vitor, let me ask you a question. Do you know what this base64 encoded image looks like? Do you know what this actually visualizes to?
I think you overestimate my capability of converting base64 on the fly, so no, not really. Is there a better way to visualize that, or to have an idea of what that is without me having to go to a website or something like that?
This is a common problem, right? So you're interacting with an API, you realize that it's getting back data. I remember I needed to visualize tables. I needed to visualize sometimes latitude and longitude. So you're taking the data, you're plugging it into somewhere else to figure out what it's actually getting back. Well, we actually do this automatically within Postman itself, and that's where the visualize button comes into play. So now I'm going to ask Postbot, which is our AI service, hey, Postbot, can we visualize this? So I actually want to visualize the response by converting this base64 encoded data to an image. And I'm going to click on that. Within a couple of seconds, Postbot's going to generate the necessary code in order for me to visualize what this looks like. And you can see, hey, look, there's a Postman holding a coffee. So let's just review something. I'm a developer, I'm coding this app. While I'm coding this app, I create a collection. While I create this collection, I'm interacting with it, I'm getting data back. I want to be able to visualize that data. You're able to visualize that data directly within Postman by using the visualize button. But Postbot actually makes it easy for you to visualize because it generates the code necessary in order to visualize it in the manner that you'd like to visualize it. Vitor, would you like to talk at all about visualization?
Yeah, so that I do actually, because not just because of the webinar, because if you can go 2 slides forward, Isaac, thank you. Just because this, since I've discovered it, has been one of my favorite features of Postman that no one uses, and I say no one kind of loosely, but every request, if you saw, has the pretty, which is the default, which gives kind of the JSON visualization if it's JSON that you're getting back, raw, preview, and visualize. And visualize is empty, because for you to transform whatever you get in the data, in the case of Isaac was JSON with base64, into something, like in the screen currently you see a temperature date graph. And to obtain that before AI, before Postbot, you would have to write the code that you see on the screen. So I love visualization, but if I have to spend half an hour writing a bit of HTML and handlebars, and I know like I know you only have to do it once and then you get it forever, but compare the delta between spending 30 minutes, even if you knew handlebars, which is the templating framework we use, even if you knew that, half an hour, the difference that we're talking about is half an hour or 1 hour or 10 minutes to click a button saying visualize response. And Postbot will try to infer sense of that data in a visualization that makes sense. So the base 64, Postbot understood that was an image. If you have tabular data in a JSON format, it will give you a table. It could give you a graph. If it doesn't give you what you want, you can actually say, Postbot, can you visualize this as a chart with this axis and that axis? And Postman is going to write that code that you see there. So I love this because in my whole life as an engineer, I've always wanted to bring people into the fold, especially product managers, business owners. And if you have 10,000 lines of JSON and that's how you experiment the API, you already alienated a massive amount of the population you work with. But if I tell a product manager, look, if you want to see if the API is returning roughly what you need from it or what you plan on getting from it, just click the send button, but then go to that visualize tab, and it will present you the information in a way that you can comprehend the business aspect of it. And that's it about visualization. Give it a try, but especially give it a try with Visualize Postman.
Let's get back to the demo. So now that we have our app up and running, our API is up and running, well, let's refresh the page. Okay, great. I can see that this API is working. Well, let's actually interact with it. So I'll add in my OpenAI key over there, and I'll say, hey, Vitor, what should I say? Maybe the Postman should hold a phone. Let's hold a phone. We'll generate that. We'll see that it's going to generate back that phone over here so we can continue to develop. Folks, if you'd actually like to follow along, you can follow along with me. Oh, look, the Postman generated a phone. So the API in general is working. Folks, whoever would like to follow along, by the way, just take out your phone and you can go to that QR code right over there. This API I've created is also available for you as well. So we'll be able to have fun together. But here's the thing. Right now, this is just working on my local development environment. What I would like to do is I'd like to continue to test this API to make sure that it looks good, like it's working as expected. Now, I'll tell you that I, as a developer, when I'm developing, I hit that endpoint maybe 100 times a day. The problem, though, is that every time I hit that endpoint while I'm testing, I'm actually incurring costs with OpenAI. It's expensive. I don't want to keep hitting that endpoint with OpenAI. Maybe I want to test other parts of the application, but still get back a good response. Well, that's where the idea of mocking comes into play. So we're going to talk about mock environments. Vitor, do you want to talk about mocking for a couple of minutes?
I do. Again, another part of Postman that I really enjoy. And people that know me know that I do get quite excited about this. In my whole career, mocking, and this has changed in the past few years, and Postman is one of the leaders in that experience of mocks them right. But when Isaac is developing an API, and we've agreed on the API, and now he has a front-end team, a mobile team, someone that just depends on the API to build another API. We want something, Isaac. We want something yesterday, right? So in my experience, and you folks might put on chat other ways of doing mocking, and I'm going back through all the beginning of time, is pretty much, if I want to simulate my app for a show and tell for a product manager, I'm going to do client-side mocking. So I'm going to write all my code, the asynchronous request, and then I'll put some code on the side to not go to the server and to return me a static payload. I hate that because that's throwaway code. And I have to keep in touch with the changes of the API to keep changing my mocks client side. Then there's the other option, which is very popular in the industry, is you do some scaffolding on the server side, you get an app running, and you ask your dev that's coding the API, hey, can you throw some payloads in there? And depending on the maturity of your company, sometimes you actually already have the pull request open and you deploy a version of the API to an actual proper server. A lot of the times when I was working, that was someone's machine in the very early days. So I'm trying to call that API, and it's the developer is restarting the service. So it's not always up, etc. It's a bit annoying. So what I love about mocking Postman is that, first of all, the mocking is a shared resource for the team. And it's everyone in the team, regardless of your role, that has access to the mock can see exactly what the mock is going to reply to. And everyone can comment on the mocks, on the examples, and make sure that that mock is up to date with what we're developing. The biggest productivity benefit I see here is that if I'm doing mocking against, if I'm integrating my client against a mock, tomorrow, if Isaac says, I have a first version ready, I'm going to deploy it to our proper dev environment. When I change that base URL, it should just work, because we've all been communicating on what the API should look like, and the mocks reflect that. In my experience, the day where I did that integration step where, oh, let me stop my client-side mocking, or let's stop contacting that dev box, it wasn't always, but often is very painful and hacking process. So what I love about the mocks is let's make sure that we're always integrating with something that looks and feels exactly like the real application. So when I change to the real application, stuff works. But more than that, day one, when Isaac hasn't written a line of code, I can go and do a show and tell to my product team. And that's why I love Postman.
Let's look at what this actually looks like. So if I wanted to create a mock, the first thing that I need is an example. Because remember, the mock is going to serve an example response. It's not going to actually hit the back end. It's just going to serve an example response so that I can continue to test and do whatever I'd like to do. So I've saved this example response called hold the coffee. What do I have to do to mock this entire API? Well, all I have to do is click mock collection. So I'll call it mock. I will save the URL and create a mock server. And what you'll notice is that this creates a new mock server called mock, as well as an environment called mock. And that environment is going to have the URL with the correct URL. It's going to have a variable with the correct URL. Now I can actually get started. So if I go back to my collection and I switch the environment to the mocked environment and I click the send button, what you're going to see is that it's going to generate that image of a Postman generating, holding a coffee. The thing to note over here is that whatever you do now in the app, when it's part of the mocked environment, when it's focused on the mock environment, it's going to generate back that image of a Postman creating, holding a coffee. If I want it to hold a phone, well, guess what? It's still going to hold a coffee because we're just sending back those responses that we've saved. Again, over here, this is super, super useful for when you're testing and you don't always want to hit that back end. You just want to be able to get a valid response back. And so now that we've already created mocks, this is actually a really great point to share this collection with my QA team, because my QA team wants to be able to test these APIs as quickly as possible. They don't want to be a bottleneck for production. As soon as you have a decent enough collection, we should actually send this over to the QA team. But how have people been sending over collections to the QA team? How have people been sharing collections in the past? Well, I'd like to actually show you how it generally works today. A lot of folks export this collection as a file. They export this collection and then try to send it over Gmail and Slack and Google Drive and SharePoint. But the big problem with this exporting the collection file is that you need to import it somewhere else. And what generally happens is developer exports a V1, QA starts working on that V1, but the developer's already at V2. So now you have these collections, what we like to term collection chaos, these collections all over the place with different versions, with no source of truth, but also with the big issue of not really having a good way to collaborate together. Well, there's a magic button over here, and that's called the sharing button. So if I go to this Postman generator workspace and I click on workspace settings, I can actually just add people to my workspace. And this means that they see the collections that are up to date, that are always changing. So imagine I'm dev and I share this collection with QA. QA can actually start to write the tests in these endpoints, and I as dev can see those tests. And if there's an issue with those QA tests that have been created, we can start to communicate directly within the same environment. So I'm going to invite, for example, Amanda Nichols, send that invite, and within a couple of seconds, Amanda now gets the notification and is going to start to join this, is going to also join this workspace. This is a huge thing, right? Like this invitation to collaborate within this one environment means that you're no longer sending these collections back and forth. So now imagine I'm QA and I see the visualization. I see exactly what this API does. I no longer have to search how this API works. Well, now is a great time to create new tests. So now I, as QA, can tell Postbot, hey, listen, Postbot, can you actually add some more tests for me? Postbot, can you add some tests? And of course, Postbot is going to respond back with a number of different tests generated based off of the response data and the structure of this collection of this API. Now, the amazing part is that if I'm a new QA person, or if I'm used to pointing and clicking on things in order to create tests, I can just use Postbot in order to generate these tests directly within Postman.
And Isaac, like if folks are not too familiar with Postbot, one of the coolest things about Postbot, first of all, like the visualized, when I'm starting to write a whole suite, the first thing I do is I just say, Postbot, generate me some tests. After that, I see what Postbot comes up with, and I then say, Postbot, add a test for this, add a test for that, add a test for that. After that, either I go down into the code, as if you use Postbot, another code AI tools, at some point you go into the code yourself to fix something, but Postbot has that ability. So sometimes it's just easier to say, Postbot, I actually meant change that or make that the assertion. So a lot of you probably are familiar with this concept, but just the ability to kind of have a conversation with our bot and let Postbot write most of the tests is a big thing that I think is going to fundamentally change how people do it. And I saw there that it says there added tests to check for status codes, etc. So Isaac, do you want to take it over again?
Definitely. Thank you, Vitor. You can see over here, I have my tests that have been generated through Postbot. The problem over here, though, is that, like there are some issues. I already see that there's a comment over here. Vitor, like, hi, is it one of the tests is failing in QA? Can you try yourself with the payload that I added to the example? Thank you for adding that, number one, Vitor. Number two, this is the type of collaboration that should happen when we're talking about APIs. When we have this single place to see how the API functions, we can actually start to talk about it. We can comment on things. And so if Vitor is the QA team, he can comment directly on these tests, and I, as dev, can see exactly what is failing. There's no more screenshots being sent over. There's no more Zoom meetings that waste our time, that waste our developer productivity. It's actually all happening within the platform itself. Okay, we've done a couple of things just now. We've created a Postman generator collection. We've mocked this environment We've also invited people over into the workspace. We've now commented, we've collaborated, we've talked within this workspace. What's next? Like, how do we actually get this API into production? Well, every developer knows that the only APIs that actually get used are the APIs with good documentation. You need to have documentation, otherwise nobody will be able to use it. Nobody will know how to use this API. Well, here's the thing. Postman actually has been auto-documenting this collection in the background. So if I click on the collection and I click on view documentation, I could view the full documentation for this API that we've been creating. You could see the endpoints. You can see how you authorize. You can see the body and the examples that we've created as well. But a lot of times, like, this is a perfect time to invite your documentation folks, your technical writers to this collection, because they can start to add descriptions. They can start to add images like this image over here so that they can interact again in that same location. So now we have dev, QA, we have technical writers. We can also bring security in over here as well. And guess what? You're not just going to create one collection. A lot of times you need to create a lot of different collections. Maybe you also want to start doing integration testing. Maybe you also want to do performance testing and regression testing. A lot of times what we see is that there was going to be a whole bunch of different collections over here that are created that everybody can start to interact with, that everybody can use to understand how they can onboard to an API as quickly as possible. Not only that, we've also published our documentation as well. So imagine that we're now ready, we deploy into production. Well, what's the last thing that we have to do? Let's actually just change this to the production URL so we can see the API is working. And let's have the Postman hold a star because we're in space. Let's see if it works, folks. This Postman is going to hold a star, and then we'll be in a pretty good place for this API because it's already gone to production. We already have our mock environment for folks to interact with. We have our local development environment. We have everything that we need in order to interact with this API in the future as well. I want to conclude with a couple of things, and then we'll start to take some questions over here. Firstly, we spoke about collaboration. We spoke about using things like RBAC or comments on collections. There's a whole bunch of other stuff over there as well. We spoke about collaborating on forks as well. This is what first-class collaboration looks like. The ability to bring everybody into one place while you're developing this API, instead of sending things back and forth through Slack and through other means that get lost. This is all, this over here, Postman becomes that source of truth. But lastly, we spoke about the proliferation of all of those APIs, the explosion of APIs. Well, you can start to use the public API network to actually find these APIs. We also spoke about how it's been increasingly hard to interact with APIs. Start to use collections, because collections will allow you to evaluate those APIs as quickly as possible, to visualize those APIs, and to interact with those APIs. And then finally, we spoke about all those different stakeholders that are involved, from the producer to the consumer to everybody. This is where that power of a collection and workspace comes into play, because you have this single place where you can invite people in and they see the up-to-date collections, they see the up-to-date documentation, they see the up-to-date tests, all in one place, all within Postman. Thank you, folks. We'll now take a couple of questions.
And before we answer one or two questions live, let me just say that, as Isaac said, we're distributed. Isaac is talking about is presenting from New York. I'm from London. We have other people on the Q&A chat, and they're all over the place. So if you see some of these trends in your day-to-day life, do let us know, and do try to reach our regional team, because we have people locally that love to visit and love to talk about these things face to face. So now on to some questions.
Let's see what we have over here. Okay, we have a question from Emmanuel. We found that when accounts are created, workspaces are defaulted to public instead of private. Public expose all settings of the Postman platform and cause other intended consequences. Are there plans to change that so it defaults to private? I don't know if there are plans, but I think this points to the question between the different workspace visibility options over here. And so you have public, which is publicly visible to everybody. You have private, which is you can only invite folks. You have team as well if you're on a Postman team that allows people that is visible to the rest of the team within your organization. And so those are some of the different visibility settings. I do recommend making sure that you know which visibility setting you're using when you're creating a new workspace and collections within that. Vitor, did you have anything to add to that one?
No, that's pretty much the textbook answer. Thank you, Isaac. That covers it. Should we move to another one?
Yes.
Okay.
It looks like we have a question, Vitor, from Pooja. Is it possible to fork a specific folder under the collection rather than the entire collection? We work with customers that require specific workflows, and sometimes we just want them to access the specific workflow, not every workflow possible.
Good question. Actually, very good question. For forks specifically, forks work on collections and environments. There are two solutions to your problem with just this description. It might be more complex and we might need more time. But obviously, you probably already thought about this, is separating that folder into a different collection and share that. The interesting thing I saw here is that we say we work with customers. So if you're not familiar with partner workspaces, because on the plans that most people use, there's only 3 visibility scopes, which is the team, the personal, and the public. So on some of our other plans, you have the private workspace and the partner workspace. The partner workspace is where you can share specific collections, environments. It's a workspace, it's a full-blown workspace, but it's targeted so you can share. You can collaborate in that workspace live with someone from another company, from an external company. Imagine that the partner workspace is like an old school data room. You have your main office and you have this shed on the side where you take all your paperwork and the customer comes with their paperwork and you collaborate in that room. This prevents you from having to send the collection, because I'm not sure when you say we have customers, usually the problem here is that even if you're using Postman, you're then exporting a Postman collection to send to the customer. And then we get to that fallacy that we talked about before, while sending files is not optimal. So the ability to have, for example, a partner workspace where you can say, this workspace is only visible to the external folks, and I'm going to invite these people from company X, allows you to have the live collaboration that Isaac and I demonstrated with the comments and the interaction back and forth. So from your brief description, these are kind of the 2 ideas that come to mind. But like I said, sometimes we just need a bit more time to talk. Isaac?
Thank you, Vitor. We have another question, a question from Sam. So how is data security handled for mocks? Is my mocked response publicly available? Where is it hosted? A couple of things to note over there. So mocks are hosted in the Postman cloud. There is an available option to make it private, which would then require an API key in order to access that mock. Remember, we're using those, we're sending back the mocked responses based off of the examples that you're saving as well. So make sure that those examples don't have any PII or something like that you don't want exposed as well. Anything you'd like to add, Vitor?
No, just that the fact that there's also tooling that integrates with Postman. We got together to do some hacking, and there's actually ways to leverage Postman mocks on your local host if you really wanted to. So there's so much tooling around Postman and our APIs that you would be surprised. And as it was mentioned before, mocks can be protected with API keys. So if that's your concern, you can apply those as well. So they wouldn't be available.
I have another question from Sushant. Quick question: when QA starts engaging, seems they start writing tests on their main workspace. Should they not fork the workspace and submit tests for review before merging the tests into master? Keen to know what this workflow would look like. This is actually great because we didn't talk about fork and pull, but the reality is when you are working with a QA team with multiple people, you're probably going to want to use fork and pull for that main collection as well, because that starts to give you the ability to review those collections before they're actually merged back into the main collection. So the answer is we didn't show that this time. I'm gonna put a plug in for you probably want to come back next time when we talk about that more in depth. But that's definitely a workflow that we would recommend, especially when you have multiple people, so that they're not stepping over each other's toes. Question from Aaron. Vitor, maybe you can answer this one. Can API networks be used to create internal developer portals with API documentation resources? If so, can you share any implementation guides for this use case?
100%. So there is the public API network that Isaac showed has a sibling called the private API network, which basically is your ability to discover in your portal for internal APIs, very similarly to how Isaac demonstrated the public API network. So the public is for the open source and for the public APIs out there, and then the private API network will be your curated wall of all the APIs in your company, regardless of their state, regardless of their technology. Today we focused a lot on RESTs, but a lot of companies will have a lot of GraphQL, gRPC, etc. And having a first stop shop where you say, okay, I want to understand if someone has developed this kind of API. And you can use the private API network. You can use Postman's global search to go and search by things that are part of requests, actually inside schemas. Postman to me is the de facto platform where I want to go and find that API. And today we focused on examples which are public, but a lot of our work is working with companies where the public, right, is the tip of the iceberg that you can see, is the 4 or 5 APIs that they expose to the public. And now you have this massive block of ice under the water, which is business to business APIs. Semi-private APIs, which you provide to other partners under contract, internal APIs. So for sure, in terms of implementation details, nothing I can share just now, like as the webinar is live, but I would recommend you to look at partner workspaces and private API network on Postman, and that should show you how to leverage those. There should be very good YouTube videos on those as well. So thank you for the question.
Folks, we're at time. We had a great time talking to you all. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you, everybody, and excited to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much. Nice to have you all. Cheers.